shoot. I'm going to record and stream this again like I did the ZBrush class. So hopefully that's going to be sitting up here on YouTube. He says. James Swanley.
You have to go to the
It's like a little bit weird. Right, so guys, you should be able to get this on YouTube as well. If you go to the BA Games Swansea channel, you should be able to find the live stream on there. There we go. Thumbs up. So BA Games Swansea and the current live stream. Lag is like on that. There you go. That's good. There you go, nice bit louder. Okay, so the end of last class we had an asset exported out of Maya as an FBX ready to paint. Those who don't are going to have to discuss that with their classmates and how to do that for anyone who wasn't here in the last class. But today we're going to bring that asset into Substance Painter and I'm going to go through the process of setting it up to paint and all of that. This video will be available on YouTube afterwards so you can watch over the class again. I've got the microphone turned on my tablet, so hopefully it's recording my voice as well. Good. How does it sound? Is it coming out alright? Testing, testing. This is Sick Man speaking. That's not bad actually. I'm quite happy with that. Cool. Right, you can mute that now. I really don't want the feedback. Okay, so like you just saw with John, first thing we're going to do is File and then New. For the record, this is the exact same process to go through inside of Substance Painter 2 as well. Unbelievable, it's doing the exact same thing. Different device, same as last week. I can't make a new file. I did this earlier and it worked fine. Substance Painter 2, adios. Let's try again. There we go. See? Substance Painter 2. So again, the first thing we want to do is select our template of PBR Metal Rough. Again, we're painting with a physically based renderer. We spoke a little bit last week about what that really means. And then we should see some more of that results from this as we move on with the class. For mesh, I'm going to select the asset that I exported last week, that I've transferred over to my tablet, my Visual Studies asset design, meshes, and my explosive barrel static mesh. I'm going to select that. Again, unlike the characters you've done with John, there isn't a low poly and a high poly version of these assets. You're welcome to take them to ZBrush and paint in extra detail if you want. The process we're going to go through is exactly the same. We are going to bake down detail, even if we're baking it down from a low poly onto a low poly.
I would suggest with assets that actual details like dents and everything like that are actually done in Substance rather than ZBrush, because it's a little bit more controlled and you can control your brushes better. So for assets, if you're doing extra details like scratches, I would use the materials and the available brushes inside of Substance. Don't take into ZBrush and try and do it, okay?
Don't open Substance Painter 2, it's Substance Painter 1 we're interested in. Substance Painter 2 won't open, as there isn't a license on that machine. Again, after this, we've got our normal map format between DirectX and OpenGL. The one we're looking for is DirectX because we're going into a DirectX environment after this. So that's the handedness for the normal map format that we want. again, when you guys are out in industry, it's going to be up to you to check the documentation or to ask the engine guys what style of maps they're going to require and the tools you're using there. But as we're using Unreal, we're interested in DirectX. Yeah, the next one is compute tangent space per fragment. This is if we're going to be looking at basically surface detail and the angles of that per pixel on the screen, or if we want to bake that via the vertices. I'm going to leave that off because I don't think it's really necessary for the painting procedure. But again, how that's done in real time, whatever engine you end up using, is down to them. And document resolution, John's right, we can leave that at 1024 to start off with. But like I said last week, Substance Painter is unique in the fact that its document resolution is dynamic. We set 1024 here. It's not like setting a 1024 map in Photoshop. At any point we can change the resolution, and instead of upscaling or downscaling the strokes we've painted and the pixel information, Substance Painter will repaint all of those strokes at the higher or lower resolution, which can reveal extra detail or eliminate detail depending on which way you're going. But it allows you to say, paint a map out a 1K map and then bake it out in a 4K map and get all the extra details you couldn't see at the time. It's really, really powerful. But I'm going to leave it at a 1K map for now because that's all right. But underneath that, we can add any existing texture maps or normal maps, anything we already have for this asset. We don't have anything, so we don't need to bring any in. So I can ignore that part, and I can just click OK at the bottom, and it will import my asset there. So there's our asset sitting in the scene, the little explosive barrel in the style of Oddworld that I've designed and modeled inside of Maya. Again, the viewport inside of Substance Painter moves in the exact same way that Maya's viewport does. If you hold down Alt and left click in the scene, you're going to rotate around it. Again, for my pen in this tablet, I've got the left click assigned to the nib. So if I hold down Alt and just click my pen in the scene, I can rotate. If you hold down Alt and I believe it is right click on the mouse, you can zoom in and out. Again, I've got the right click assigned to the first button on my pen. Alt and middle click allows you to track the camera around. And again, I've got that on the second button of my pen. So my pen can function as my mouse and I don't have to jump between the two. If you don't have that, you need to set that up in your Wacom tablet options, either here or at home. The other thing with Substance Painter is, unlike Maya where you rotate around a focus point, the focus point inside of Substance is wherever your cursor is over the surface. So if I move my cursor over the central bit of surface and rotate the camera is going to rotate around that point. If I move it over here and rotate, I'm now rotating around that point instead. So it can enable you to really focus on whatever part of the model you're actually painting on. It's rather useful as a tool goes. So any questions about viewport navigation in Substance Painter at this point? Nope. Okay. So to look at the rest of the interface, underneath the viewport, we've got the shelf. The shelf contains all your brushes and preset materials. Again, you're going to make a lot of your own materials and painting, and you can save them down here later on. But on the left of the shelf, we've got basically every single thing that exists inside Substance Painter right now. The default for this part of the shelf is to show you the alphas. So it's all your alpha maps. This is the way you can change the behavior of a brush and how it paints. Again, you can look here at all the other different maps and generators and textures and filters, all these different things that exist within inside Substance Painter. They're a little bit outside the scope of this class, so I'm going to leave the majority of them alone, but they're up to you to learn about and look up later on. In the middle of the shelf, we've got the brushes. So these are preset brushes so we can get very specific brush behavior, such as the dirt brush or a fingerprint brush. We get sort of a sandpaper or a scratch brush if we want to make the surface of our model a little bit rougher. Substance Painter also has particle brushes, so we can paint with particles. These are really good at getting water damage onto a scene or making something look cracked. These exist in here and we can use them. But again, I'm going to largely ignore them. They're outside of the scope of this class. And there are some tools that exist for getting very specific kind of looks on your model, such as metal scratches, oil leaks, frost, bullet impact holes, and all of that. But again, this will be for you to look up in this. I'm mainly interested with brushes today. And on the right side of the shelf, we've got preset materials. So and you can use these to set up your brushes to paint in a specific way. So if you want to paint with some car paint, you want to paint with some concrete, or perhaps some some gold, you can choose preset brushes over here, or we can configure our own in the brushes panel over on the far right. Any questions about the shelf? Splendid. On the right hand side of the viewport is our layer stack, and this functions exactly the same way as Photoshop's layer stack does. So we build up these different layers we paint. We can build up fill layers which cover the entire model. We can build up individual layers which just cover this, individual brush strokes where we're painting. We can group stuff, and we can also mask different sections of the model in the layer stack using various alpha channels and masks, which is going to be a big part of what we're going to do today. The masking system inside of ZBrush really sets it apart as well. So that's going to be very important for us as things go on. Underneath that, we've got another sort of part of the shelf really, more than anything else. But this allows us to control, let's bring this up so I can see it a little bit more. Some of our world options. Again, there's 3 different tabs for these. I'm just going to group these all under world options as such. First one here is our texture set settings. So this controls the texture that we're painting and how we see the model. So later on in there, we're actually even going to be able to see the textures. Actually, I'm just going to switch over. We've got the undo stack there. If I click on that, it can show you all the different things you can undo. And the texture set stack, which is going to show you all the ways in which we can paint. So again, when we set our maps to 1024 at the start, when we created this new scene, it gave us a 1024 map. Here under size and texture set, we can see all the different sizes of maps we can choose. And again, you can change this at any point. So if you've been painting along with a 1024 map and go, you know what, I want to see what this is going to look like as a 4K texture, you can bump that up to a 4K texture, and Substance will repaint all your brush strokes instead of scaling them, so you can see all that hidden detail you couldn't see before without having any artifacts or compression issues in the scaling. Or you can bump it down the other way and it will repaint it also as a 512 map if you wanted to see what it would look like on a lower resolution. And again, it will repaint all the strokes, it won't scale them, so you can see really what that's going to look like on that. It's a really, really useful system. I'm going to leave that 1024. Underneath that, we've got all the different channels we can currently paint on. We discussed these briefly last week. We've got, we've got the base color channel. This is often still referred to as a diffuse channel, but that's incorrect. Diffuse channels are part of the sort of legacy shading methods of Fond-Bling or Lambert shading. They dictate how the surface of a model should look under exactly 1 unit of light under perfect lighting conditions. That doesn't make any sense in PBR shading because we're dealing with a physically based environment. Our light is dealt in lumens and amount of lumens in the world. The base color does is it dictates the wavelength of the light that is going to be emitted or reflected from your model. So again, like a green leaf on a plant, it absorbs all the light that hits it and emits the green light out again. Again, the white light on these walls, they're absorbing light, they're emitting a huge amount of light back out of them in all the different wavelengths. Again, that red resistance-free poster up there, it's absorbing light, its base color is red, so it's emitting that red light back out again. Underneath that, we have height, and this is essentially allows you to paint custom normal maps onto your surface, so you're painting pretty much whether or not your surface is bumped up or bumped down, but when that comes to variety of rendering, you're essentially painting curved normals around the edges of this brush stroke, which allow the surface to look like it's been bumped up or bumped down. It's not actually bumping up or down the surface at all, it's just making it look like it is. So it's the difference between this and say ZBrush. ZBrush, when you make a stroke and tell it to bump up a surface, it's going to physically pull that surface out of the model. The height in this, it's just going to bend the normals around the edge of your brush stroke to make it look like it's bumped up or bumped down. Underneath that is the roughness channel, and this controls how smooth the surface is. With no roughness at all, it has a completely default smooth surface across it. So as smooth as a surface can be, or as smooth as your normals exist. As you start bringing up a roughness, it essentially is going to simulate that you've got some disturbance on the surface. I'm just going to open up Photoshop and kind of show you what I mean here. So let's just, not that one. Let's draw a little vertex there, a little vertex there, and an edge between them. Let's maybe get another edge over here. So if we had no roughness at all, but again, this is what your 3D model would look like. So let's have a look at that edge there. If, and let's say magnifying it up a bit, on a surface with 0 roughness, you were to zoom in on that, that surface is going to look perfectly flat and smooth and look pretty good. On an area that's got a very high roughness, actually just go rough equals 0. But over here, if this area had a roughness of 1, if we were to zoom in and look at it, the surface is going to look sort of like that on a microscopic scale. The idea being that any light wave that comes and hits this first one with 0 roughness, it's going to hit it and it's just going to bounce straight off again. Almost a perfect reflection. Over here, light wave's going to come in, it's going to hit that point, it's going to hit there, it's going to hit there, and then finally it can bounce out again. But on a much different trajectory than if it was on a smooth surface. Again, light wave here is going to hit that one and bounce off up here as well. So it scatters the light. It's simulating micro facets and micro disturbances on the surface of your model to scatter light when they come into contact with that surface. And underneath that is metallic, which details how much of a conductive surface your model is, whether or not it interacts with electromagnetic waves or not. And again, ideally, this is really an on-off switch when it comes to metallic. Something either is or isn't metallic in the real world. When it comes to painting stuff, we do kind of use that on a grayscale. So we can make something a little bit metallic, or a lot metallic, or not metallic at all. We use it in between it to get the appearance of the surface we want. So we don't quite treat metallic as a painting channel as realistically as perhaps we should, or realistically as the real world works, but we treat it in the way we need to get the result that we want as such, if that makes sense. So we vary it to get the response we're looking for. Again, you've got the control to do that in here. In addition to those 4 default channels, we can add more channels and mess with them if we want to. There is a little plus icon over here. I'm just going to click on that, and you can see all the different channels you can add if you really, really want to. Opacity is a channel you might want to add if you're working with a transparent surface, but for that, the template you'll need to be working with will be the alpha test template. We spoke about that last week. That will give you a chance to have transparent sections of your surface, as say if you're painting a window, for example. But I'm not going to do that. That's the only other channel you might consider adding, really, when push comes to shove, is the emissive channel. And the emissive gives your surface the ability to generate light. Instead of just interacting with light that exists in the scene, it can start outputting light and actually shining out into the world. So if you want some part of your model to actually be emitting light, like it has a light source on it, you will need to add the emissive channel, and then you can paint with that as well. So again, if you're doing a computer screen, or you've got an object with a little LED light in the corner of it, you're going to want to turn on emissive and paint with that as well.
It's also handy to have the emissive there, even if you're not going to paint anything specifically on at the moment, to actually have emissive points that you can maybe control something like Unreal later on as well.
Exactly.
Even if you're not going to literally put an emissive colour on it, it's good to have an emissive map that you can control. In fact, it's better that you don't put any colour on it, so you can control it in something like Unreal later on.
We'll look a little bit more of that in the second semester. For this, make it look the way you want it to look, and then the second semester we're going to look at having a lot of control over these. Again, if I look at these channels here, the base, colour, the height, the roughness, and then have a look at my brush next to it, I can see colour, height, rough and metallic. Those are the available channels to paint on, because those are the channels that exist here in the texture set. And if I just add that emissive channel, you can see that emissive has now been added there, and I can enable that, and I can start painting emissive if I so want to. So again, John's right, it's good practice to just turn on emissive so you've got that opportunity if you want it there. It should really be a default channel. Underneath that, we've got the additional maps. So this is where we baked those maps down in John's class a moment ago. We're going to come back to that in a minute because I'm going to want to bake some maps down for this model. But again, it shows you all the different kind of maps you can bake, and then they can be applied to that model so they change the way we perceive it and then work on top of it. Any questions about the channels? Okay, great. Adjacent to the texture set settings tab in this sort of world settings section, we've got post effects. Again, I'm going to leave these alone pretty much with this, but these allow us to put some post-processing effects in the scene. So for a final image, final render, if you want to take a screenshot of it and make it look really good before you put an art station or something, you might want to turn these on, and then you can work with different color corrections. You know, we can change the way that scene looks, contrasts. So you can make it black and white and make it bright. You can change the bias on that. Do a bit of sepia. These are only really useful for when you're doing a final render and just want to make it look shiny and have that image for your portfolio or something. You should not have post-process effects turned on when you're painting, because they will change how you see the paint layers and will change what you're painting, so what comes out might not look quite the way you thought it did. So ideally you want them permanently turned off while you're painting. You want to leave them well alone. And finally, we've got the viewer settings over here, and this changes how we see the world itself and how we interact with that. So we can change how we can see the world firstly. So I've got mode that says material there. I click on that. We've got material, solo, and additional map. So the material allows us to see all the different channels of the PBR working on the model at one time, so we can see the actual result. The additional map, I believe, allows us to see one of these additional maps. So if we want to see what that normal map looks like, an ambient occlusion map, a thickness map, we can just switch that over to additional map and we can preview that. Or we can go solo and we can see individual channels. So we can just look at base color with no sort of roughness interaction or normal interaction on it. We can just look at the roughness. We can just look at different parts of that. In fact, I'm just going to give myself a bit of a color here. Let's go for blue, say. I'm going to get some height, I'm going to get some roughness and some metallic, and I'm just going to squiggle across that surface. Because, again, I've also got a bit of emissive on there as well, in a different channel. So a squiggle on that surface. So if I change my mode here to solo, firstly, I'm viewing base color. So you see the environment disappears. I can see only where I've painted that base color stroke, and I can see base color up here in the top left-hand corner. And then I can cycle through the different channels by pressing the C key on the keyboard. Or over here in the viewer settings, under mode where solo, we now see view, and we can choose the different channels over here as well. I find it a bit easier just to use C on the keyboard to cycle through them. So I hit C, we're going to switch over to height. So there's the height channel, that's what the height color actually looks like. Again, unaffected by any rendering stats, that's just the raw color of that channel. There's the roughness, just what the roughness value looks like there, just as a raw color. The metallic as a raw color, and the emissive as a raw color. And as I keep pressing C, it will cycle through those channels. And if you want to get back to material, the shortcut is M, or we can change it over here back to material in the viewer settings. So M, and we're back. Underneath that different mode, we've got how we can see the world in the material settings. So the first one there is environment map. If I just scroll out, in fact, I'm just going to kill off the blur so we can see what this is. So Substance does its lighting using a high dynamic range image map. So this is a spherical map that goes all the way around our scene. And if we're very lucky, I might even be able to see the seam on it. I can't. Great. So this is a map, a series of photos someone's taken, and they've been compiled into a big spherical world map, and that world is actually casting light into our scene, and we're using those light rays to illuminate our model. So under environment map, this drop down here, I can change the different kind of maps to change how we preview this and see it in different lighting. So this gives us a panorama, gives us a very good outdoor lighting setting. I can change this to whatever this one is. So cave entry in the forest. So we can see that, we've got a lot of green light on this now being emitted from all those leaves. Let's change this again. What's this one here? Industrial room. It's kind of a classroom here, and we can see what that light is going to look like. So we can preview what this is going to look like in different environments and paint accordingly. Personally, I like to put this over to one of the studio lighting setups that exist within side of Substance, because this gives you a nice white light environment, a kind of very raw environment, and you don't get any sort of the blues from the sky in the panorama. Is this the panorama? There we go. So there's a lot of blue and yellows on your model from this, which again can change the way you paint. That cave one, that's got a lot of greens onto it, but this Studio 2 gives you a lot of white light, so you tend to paint much more raw on this. I really like this one as a default setup. Underneath that you've got opacity, so you can change how much of that you can actually see in your environment, so you can fade out. I'm just going to go back to the panorama so you can really see what's happening here. So I can fade that out. So you basically fade it out to grey or see the whole thing. Again, this is your preference. This is just a preference of how you want to see this. This isn't actually changing any lighting values. It's just removing our ability to see it. However, underneath that, the exposure does change the lighting. If I crank up that exposure on the light, it really is going to pumping out more light into this scene. And again, if I bring it down, it's going to pump less. And actually, if I bring it down, you can really see that emissive taking effect and glowing red, because that bit is emitting light into the world. So changing your exposure is a good way to preview your emissive channels. But other than that, by default, you probably want to leave this at 0, so you're not messing with the lights. You can see that you're modeling a more sort of raw lighting environment. Underneath that, we can rotate the environment around, so we can cast the light on the model from different directions. And we can also increase the blur on the environment. Again, this doesn't affect the environment with our lighting levels at all, just how we see it. So I like to have my environment a little bit blurred so that I'm not really being distracted by any of the shapes inside of that environment. And again, I'm just going to switch this back over to that Studio 2 environment lighting, so it's nice white light. So again, blurring doesn't really have much of an effect on this. But nevertheless, if you do scroll around to some parts, you can see these sort of harsh lights, studio lights above it. Adding a bit of blur onto them does help, so then you don't get a sharp line suddenly appear in the background. Underneath that, we can turn shadows on and off if you want shadows. Substance's shadow computation is a bit bizarre. So I tend to turn that off. Again, it's only really a preview for shadows. It's a bit sort of computationally heavy, and if I move around there, that looks pretty good, but I'm getting a lot of flicker in that as it's trying to resolve all the different light rays. So in general, I turn shadows off to work. Any questions so far? Cool. Underneath that, we've got these shader parameters. Again, we can see that PBR Metal Rough shader that we chose earlier is sitting there. So if you accidentally chose the wrong one, you can change it here. But in general, you're going to want to leave that well alone. Try and set up your scene correctly. I'm going to ignore the shader parameters underneath that, as again they're a bit outside the scope of this class. Then underneath that, we've got a stencil opacity. So if we're using a stencil to kind of limit the screen area we can paint in, so if I'm like spray painting for a stencil on the screen, we can do that as well. And this controls how much we can see of that stencil. I'm going to leave that alone, but you can change it. And underneath that, we can turn on or off a wireframe version of our model and change the opacity of our wireframe. In general, often we'd want this turned off, but if you're trying very hard to paint down a particular edge of the model, then it's quite useful to be able to turn that on and off. But I'm just going to turn him off for now. Yeah, again, adjacent to the wireframe is a color picker, that little red icon. You can click on that and it will show you the color of your current selected for the wireframe. Let's just put that to black for now. I quite like the red one, but again, this is up to you. This is how you configure the scene to work for you. Same way as sort of with the environment opacity and the environment blur. It's up to you to configure this so it works for your pipeline. You can find your own method. I'm just going to destroy that paint layer I did earlier because I don't really like him. And jump back to my texture set settings. Right. Any question before we get going proper? That's covered sort of the oh, actually one last thing. Above the brush parameters is your texture set list, which shows you all the materials that you have on your model, and you can turn materials on and off, and when you do that, you'll only see the parts of the models that have those materials applied to them. There's only one material on this object, so I can't do that, and that material is called explosive barrel _matte. And again, that's the name we gave it in Maya, so it was really clear what kind of material that was. We can see them up here in the texture set list. So this is where you'll see all the different materials that you've got applied to your model. So again, any questions before I get on, start painting this guy proper? None? Splendid. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bake some maps on this in the sort of same way that John did for the head. So I'm going to go back to the texture set settings, and when I look at this, I've got a big Bake Textures button next to my additional maps. If I click on Bake Textures, it's going to bring up the baking dialog box. Down the left side of this box are all the different kind of maps it could possibly paint. A few of these have warning signs next to them because I haven't specified a high resolution model yet for it to get that information from. But we will in a minute, so they'll disappear when I do that. The normal, up here, this is normal data it will take from the high polygon model and bake down onto the low polygon surface to basically simulate that the surface has more polygons than it does. It's taking the vertex, the normal from each vertex on the high polygon model, and turning that into a color on a texture map, which is then going to use instead of vertex normal data from the low poly model. So you can simulate having high polygons on a low polygon model. World space normal controls, which direction a surface is pointing within the world itself. So if a face is pointing forwards, backwards, upways, downways, whatever, it takes that data and turns that into a color as well. So that can be used by various other parts of Substance Painter to control the way it does things. For example, there's certain things in Substance Painter called generators. There's a particular generator which finds the edges of models, so where hard edges are. So when a normal is going to change very quickly from one direction to another, and it can use this to cause damage and erosion around edges, such as you often see around metal shapes where you see erosions around the edges of it. If you look at a lot of guns in modern gaming, you'll see all these edges have been eroded around the sides of them to give lots of detail onto them. That comes from Substance Painter, because Substance Painter can find that data. We use various other ones of these maps to find that. Often things like the normal, the world space normal really helps with that kind of thing. Underneath that is the ID map. The ID map takes vertex colors, because vertices can hold colors, takes the vertex colors of the high polygon model and then turns that into a texture map as well. This can be quite good and useful for masking out particular sections of models, but in general, I prefer to mask by hand. I find that a lot more usable, because then you can do it on the fly. You don't have to plan all your masking ahead of time and paint your mask on a high polygon model and bake your mask or a low polygon. Jesus Christ, it's a hassle. So I tend to ignore the ID maps. Underneath that is ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion basically controls the lighting in very sort of tough areas. For example, if you look at the base of one of these monitors, you see that the base looks really, really dark. Because light finds it very hard to bounce around into those areas. It might try to bounce around big open areas. If it tries to bounce in here, it hits there, bounces out before it gets a chance to bounce around and go and illuminate that surface. So what ambient occlusion does is it looks at those kind of areas. It back sends a whole load of light rays into this model and then gathers up all the areas that it hits and doesn't hit and then gives them a colour value from dark to light, basically. And then it will change the way light affects and bounces on the surface to really make those dark areas, the really bits where light struggles to get into, much darker. For example, if you have a look at my model here, you're around this section between these and sort of in this little indent along here, light's going to struggle to get in there, so that ambient occlusion map is going to bring that detail out a little bit. And we'll see that in a moment when I bake this down. The curvature map details, the extent at which your model goes from a very smooth to a very sudden curve or sharp curve. Again, it's used by the generators inside of Substance. The position map details the world position of each individual point on the surface of the model, again useful in generators. And the thickness map details how thick your model is at different sections if it was casting a ray straight from one side to another. This is useful for subsurface maps which allow light to penetrate through an object, such as with the ears of a person. You can obviously light glowing through ears, glowing through hair, things like that. They use subsurface scattering renderers to do that. But again, these are kind of outside of the scope of what we're doing today, or outside of the scope of a lot of what we'll do. So a lot of these I want to ignore. I'm not interested in them at all for what I'm doing today. So I'm going to turn them off. There's a little tick box next to all of these, so anything I'm not interested in I can turn off. For this model, I'm only really interested in the ambient occlusion map, but I'm going to leave on the normal map because you guys will be doing that with your character head, so I want you to see baking that down as well. But I'm going to turn off world normal, I'm going to turn off ID, I'm going to turn off curvature, I'm going to turn off position and turn off thickness, so we don't bake those down when we don't need to. One of the things about baking textures down inside a Substance Painter is they're not stored as external texture files, they're stored in your Substance Painter save file. So the more textures you've got baked down, the bigger your file is, so it's not worth baking down something you're not going to use. I'm just going to select the common criteria over here so I can see basically the common behaviors that I'm going to bake down. Again, the top one of these is the output size. By default it's on a 1024 by 1024 pixel map. Often with things we'll actually bump this up to maybe a 2K map for these settings. Let's bump it up to a 2K map for today. This isn't dynamic. When these are baked down, this is the way that texture map is. You can only change the size of these maps by coming back in here and baking them again. They are finalized texture maps. So you've got to select the size you want to work on. Typically, we kind of overscale them and choose a bigger size than we're actually interested in. Again, a 1024 is probably fine for this model, but I'm going to go for a 2K map just in case. But again, there's not really much detail on this model, so it probably really isn't. Actually, let's put it down to a 1024. That should be fine. Underneath those settings, we've got our high poly parameters. So again, this high definitions mesh section, this is where you choose the high polygon version of your character. Or if we're baking down an asset like this to get ambient occlusion out of it, we're going to choose our low polygon one and just bake the detail down from itself onto itself, basically. So in this section here, I'm going to click on this little folder icon on its right. It's going to open up a dialog box. I'm going to choose my explosive barrel again and click open. And then we can see him listed there in the high definition meshes. If you select the wrong one, or there's already a mesh listed in there, because sometimes Substance likes to remember this stuff, you're going to need to select that guy, hit the negative icon to remove him, and then select a new file. So you only really want one in there at any given time. Again, for this exercise today, I'm going to use the actual low polygon version of this guy again and bake it down to capture that ambient occlusion out of it. For your heads, you'll need to choose the high resolution version of those models to do that, and then that'll bake down all the sort of surface detail you've sculpted onto it as well. The rest of these options I'm going to pretty much leave alone because their default settings are pretty good and it's what I always want. The only one I'm really interested in out of these at all is the anti-aliasing drop down, which controls how much anti-aliasing we're going to give to any sort of hard polygon borders in those texture maps. Again, description of what anti-aliasing is kind of outside the scope of this class. As game students, I expect you know. If you don't, it'll be up to you to have a look for this. But reality is I'm going to leave that off, but the higher level you put of anti-aliasing on this, the more the edges of it, things are going to get a little bit softer and a little bit more blurred. In reality, this can make your seams show up a little bit more than you might want, so I tend to leave anti-aliasing off. You either need a really high anti-aliasing level or none at all, or else your seams tend to show up. But anti-aliasing is computationally heavy, so the higher level you have of that, the longer it's going to take to bake your textures down. So consider that when you're doing it. So for today, I'm going to choose none because I want these to bake fast. And then I'm going to hit Bake Textures. There we go. Again, the normal map on this isn't going to have much of an effect because there is no difference in surface detail between the high and low resolution map. In fact, if I scroll over here, let's find my normal map textures. There it is. Actually, yeah, if I just leave my cursor over it, it should show us. There is a completely blue flat map. There's no detail in it. Again, these are the colours that we've agreed on in this. So, blue is the sort of point to your normal out of it colour. So this is just saying keep using the vertex normals. There's no change in there because there's no difference between the height of this model and the model I just baked onto it. However, that ambient occlusion one, that does have quite a bit of detail into it. And we can really see that on the model. If I zoom into it, all those little corners in it are much darker now, and we can really see the shape of this model. Again, I'm just going to turn off that ambient occlusion map so you can see what it looks like without it, and turn it back on again so you can see what it looks like with it. It really reveals the surface detail, but it doesn't there, by controlling how the light interacts with these corners. So at this point, I'm going to save, because I know 3D programs, sooner or later, they're going to crash. I've already made a little folder to save it in here. I'm just going to save over that one from last week. Substance Paint is pretty quick at saving if you don't have too much in it. Again, any questions at this point? No? None? Splendid. All good? So now I'm ready to actually start painting on my model. I've set him up, he's looking quite nice. But before I start painting him, I'm actually going to start masking different parts of him off so I can control how I'm painting him. For example, these lights on his side, they're going to glow red into the scene. I'm going to have nice metal bracket around them, and then this main body is probably going to be brushed metal, maybe a different kind of metal on the base. This is going to be illuminated here as well. There's going to be another metal on this top ring, and then this is going to glow nice and red as well. Now if I was to try and paint that in, let's just have a go at that. None of that, no roughness, no metallic. Again, just trying to paint that on the light. It's really, see, I'm already actually gone over the borders and I'm painting onto this bit that I actually want to be really sort of harsh metal. I'm going across the borders there where I don't want to. But Substance Painter does have a very useful masking system which allows us to mask different parts of the model so we can only paint in those sections. So that's what I'm going to do. And then when I do this, I'm also going to set up a base material for each one of these sections before I start painting on top of it. So I'm just going to eliminate that. So over here on the layer stack, we've got a few things we can do. I'm just going to cover them first. This little plus icon creates a painting layer, which allows us to paint anywhere on the model. Destroy him. Next to him is a fill layer, which fills the entire model, or the entire area that's unmasked, with whatever colour or settings you have over here. Again, the properties bit here, we can see this has changed from brush to fill. Let's add another brush. See, properties paint, choose my fill layer, properties fill, and this changes our behaviour. So if I set a base colour here, it applies it to the entire model. It has filled the entire layer. If I change my roughness, it applies to the entire area. Same thing with the metallic and the emissive. So then delete him and delete him. What's that? I'm unfamiliar with the other icon. So these are default materials that we could just drag and drop on. I prefer pulling them out of the material. I think these are smart materials. I'm not a big fan of smart materials. Again, there is the copper, because they're taking so much additional information with them. So, but yeah, those look like copper. So turn him off. And on the right side of the smart materials is folders. We can make folders to store stuff in our layer stack. So let's add a couple of layers, and I can drag and drop them into that folder in the same way that I might be able to in, say, Photoshop. So now I can hide all of that. And if I just paint on one of those layers, I can hide that entire folder of layers as well. There's a lot of control we can do in this stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill my stack with folders and base materials and masks to break apart this model into default sections, and then we can start painting across on them. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a fill layer, and I'm going to start with these lights. So they're going to be red, so I'm going to make a nice red on that. They're going to be really rough in terms of that there should be scattering the light out. They're not going to have any metallic, so I'm going to leave that metallic on 0. And of course they're going to emit as well. So that's made my model really hard to look at with all of those settings on. So I'm going to my viewer settings, I'm going to turn on that wireframe so I can see what I'm doing now. So I've got that fill layer here. I'm going to double click on his name, then I can give him a good name. So I'm going to call this lights base, because he's the base of my lights, and I can paint additional things on top of him if I want to. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this lights group. So I'm going to group all my lights into this folder. I'm going to get my lights base and drag and drop him onto that folder. I'm going to save my scene because I don't trust 3D programs. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mask to that folder. We can add masks to layers, folders, fill layers, paint layers, whatever we want to inside a Substance Painter. But this really allows us to break our model apart and gives us a huge amount of control. So that lights group selected, I'm going to right click on him, and right at the top I've got add white mask, add black mask, add bitmap mask, or mask with color selection. I'm going to add a black mask to him, and when I do that, that entire layer and its effects are going to disappear. Again, if I add a white mask to him, it's all going to reappear. So what's happening here is that the black is saying do not apply this folder or anything in it to the parts of the model that are painted black. If it's white, it's apply this folder to it, and again you've got varying grayscales in between. And you might look at when I have that mask selected, my properties are changed to paint, and I can only paint in a grayscale between black and white for that mask. If I change back to my layer, my options return. So I'm going to choose that mask, and to demonstrate what I'm doing, if I move my grayscale up to white and start painting, it's going to reveal that. If I put it back to black and start painting, I can paint that section out without being destructive at all to what's in that folder. It's controlling where I can and can't see what's in the folder. So I can fill that folder with loads of stuff, and it will only be in the sections that are that mask, in the section of the model where that mask is white. Again, the mask is a texture map in itself as well. Now, one of the things Substance Painter allows me to do is it allows me to mask by polygons and mask by UV maps. So it's got a really good masking system in there when it comes to control. Because, again, I don't actually want to have to paint this mask on by hand, because we're going to get exactly the same problem as before. I'm going to paint over and onto the areas I don't want to be on. So it's unpaint. Actually, I'm just going to add a new black mask in there just in case I've missed a bit. And I'm going to switch over my viewing options to show the 3D and 2D, to show you what I'm actually doing here. So now I'm going to go to my selection tools, which will allow me to select different parts of this model and I'll automatically apply whatever I've got selected to it. So I'm going to get my grayscale onto white, And I want this tool here, which is sort of fourth along on the panel, and this is my polygon fill tool. Oop, you can see I have missed a bit there, so I'll clean that mask up again. Now the polygon fill tool is really useful. So in this options, fill mode, I've got 4 different fill modes. I can fill mode by triangles, fill mode by quads, fill by objects, or fill by UV island. So I'm going to put that to triangle, and again it will fill with whatever colour I've got in here. So I'm going to pull that to white. So again, I'm quite happy with the way my UV map is laid out. So I'm pretty sure this series of triangles up here is these series up here on the top of my model. So if I select fill triangles, get it onto white, and do a drag over these triangles, I'm going to start to fill in the white parts of that mask over these sections. And now that mask, I can even see it there, you can just see that white in the mask there, where it's applied my white mask to this bit. Let's get rid of that. So that's the fill with triangles. I check that to quads. This bit here looks like my ring of quads around there, so I can paint over that. See what happens if I just go triangles on there. Yeah, we can actually see, we can even paint in the triangles on the quads there, because again, quads are triangles, as we've covered before. They're just 2 of them masquerading. So I'm just painting the rest of that section. So again, we just drag select over polygons, and it fills them in with the colour that I got here, revealing them in the mask. Finally, and most powerfully, the one I'm really interested in, the UV islands. If I switch to that, if I do a drag over a UV island, the whole thing will get selected. So you can see it being selected there. It's actually over selected. It's, you know, given I've broken those apart, I've been a bit silly. But I'll just select all of them. So I've actually got painted out onto another section which I don't really want to be on. But never fear, I can just go back to my quads. I can put my colour down to black, and I can paint out those parts I'm not interested in by painting over whole polygons with that polygon drag fill tool, which really quickly gives me that mask over the rest of it. Okay, I'll be showing shortly, man. Now, if I look at there, you can see it's giving me a really nice hard edge along that. Again, it's a little bit aliased because of the resolution of my texture map, but never fear, this is substance. I can just bump it up to a 2K, and now that's slightly diminished. If I put it down to a 512, you can really see that borderline on it. Let's put it to a 2. Let's put it back to a 1024 for now. So that's giving me a good base for that part of the model. For my lights, I've got all my lights on that one channel now. So now if I do anything to this light space, I'm only going to be affecting those areas of the model. I'm going to repeat this now for the main part of my model, this big bulbous part. So I'm going to make a new base layer, make sure he's not inside of that lights group, so I'll pull him out. I'm going to call him body base. That's a V in there, that's not how you spell. Body base. There we go. I'm going to have a look for a particular metal I might be interested in here. Let's have a look at the steel brushed. Drag and drop him on. That's a wee bit aggressive, but I'm getting there. What about this? Oh, I like that. That's good. And it's not bad as a base for the main body of my object. It's quite Oddworldish. So again, I'm going to make a new folder now. I'm going to call this body group. Again, I always group by folders. I've always mask by folders, because this gives us the option to add more layers and only to affect those parts of the model that are in that masked group. I'll demonstrate this in a second. I'm just going to drag this body base into a body group, create a new black mask, get my polygon fill tool, get my nice UV and do a drag drop of that main body part of my UV. Again, it grabs the base. I don't really want the base in this part. I want that to be different. So I'm going to go back to my quad fill, put it back to our black colour, and just remove that bit from my mask nice and quickly. I'm also missing part, which is this top ring here, and even these little polys inside of this section. So I'm just going to have to go in and paint these in by hand. So I'm just going to bring that colour back up to white and just come in and use my polygon fill tool, drag select, oops, wrong one, paint him out. And one of the reasons Substance is so widely used and looks so goddamn good is because it really gives us this control over our model by really quickly allowing us to mask out different sections and control where these effects happen, not onto others, without having to use any really complicated tools. So there we go. So that's all neatly in. In fact, that ring inside of there should actually be part of my lights group, so I'm just going to paint him in. And again, because that's a fill layer on the base and just being controlled where it is by a mask, I can really quickly add that to another section of the model or remove it from it if I don't want it there, as I just have. So he's coming along a bit. I'm just going to save that again. I'm going to jump back to a regular brush tool for now, and I'm just going to turn off that wireframe so we can see what the model is starting to look like. Again, let's just save. So we've just overrun the class for a minute, but I just want to demonstrate the power of grouping things together in folders and masking those folders. If I come down to this body group and get body base on there, just click him for a minute, I can add a new paint layer above this, and let's just say call this guy scratches. There we go. So this is a paint layer where I can paint with my brush. I'm going to get a nice scratchy type brush. So let's go scratches free. Let's go pull that up so I can see all of this. I'm going to increase the size of my brush so I can really see it there. Let's change that material I'm painting with to something a little bit more vibrant. A bit more raw, so I'm going to go uniform cobalt, drop it there on my material node. So that's given me all of this. So there's set up a couple of default options. Again, I can come in here and set these myself too. Cobalt here is a very metallic surface. It's not very rough. I want that roughness down. I'm just going to add a bit of height, and I'm going to pull this height down so I can scratch into the surface with this brush. And now, as I start to paint on it, you can see these scratches appearing. Give a little bit of variation to my surface. But because I'm painting on a layer here, that's only within this masking group, if I paint outside of it, I can't accidentally paint onto my light. I can't accidentally paint onto the bracket that holds my light. It stops my scratches right next to it. I can't get into that section no matter how much I scratch it because of where I'm painting this layer. So it also makes different areas safe from your mistakes. It means you can be a little bit more carefree with your painting, which really helps. So again, if I was properly painting this, I might dial that up a little bit and just come in here and just put a few scratches around it, make it look a bit beaten up. Again, see, really carefree painting. And again, I've got an erase tool here, so I can just erase those crappy scratches. Paint a few more of them in. And you have a nice sort of surface change across there. But that's some of the power. I know it's a really quick run through in the Substance Painter. But what you really need to do, just to take away from this, is either baking down onto this, so you can catch that nice ambient occlusion look to it in the normal data from high poly models, and this layer stack in terms of making folders in here, masking, Go now.
Can you make a folder in a folder?
You make folders and folders and folders, each with their own masks if you want to. You can mask individual layers, but I much more recommend masking folders, because then you can put additional stuff under that mask instead of having to recreate it again and again and again. So, this is what I really want you guys to take away from this. So I want you to do, for your assets at least, starting now, is to come into Substance Painter with them. Again, make a base layer for a section of your model, put it in a folder for that section of your model, mask that section, and then do that again and again and again for each different section of your model. Again, you'll need several different sections per model. Again, this one's going to end up with 4 or 5 different sections just for painting on it. Again, so say if you've got say a lamp post, for example, you've got a wooden post for that, so it'll be one mask. Your metal brackets will be another mask. The light itself of the lantern will be another sort of masked folder as well, so that might have 3 different masks on it. And again, then you can start painting up those sections and really make them look how you want them to look. Okay? So that's what I want you guys to do now. Well, you've got an hour's break, at least 2 hours break, or you're welcome to stay and keep working on it again. My 2 o'clock class isn't going to be running today because I've done this instead, but you're more than welcome to stay on this today. Other than that, any questions? Go back. Yes. It won't open the Substance Painter one. It will not. No. So if the stuff you're working on in class, you're going to have to be painting it here in the room, I'm afraid. Hold on a minute, I'm just going to